All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Managing Test Anxiety, brought to you by Georgetown's Academic Resource Center. It's nice to have everybody joining us this afternoon. My name is Carolyn Friedman, and I'm the Disability and Learning Skills Advisor for the ARC at the School of Continuing Studies.
And I'm Betsy Malarsic, and I'm a Learning Skills Specialist with the Academic Resource Center. So we want to encourage you throughout this session, if you have any questions, to post them in the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on it to see if you have anything that you want to know more about. So we'll also have time for questions at the end, but don't be afraid to reach out if you need clarification on anything. So we want to start talking about managing test anxiety by asking the question, why do tests make us anxious? And the reason it's important to figure out the source of your test anxiety is so that you better know how to approach the problem and you can be mindful in your solutions for taking care of yourself. So there are a lot of different reasons that tests make us anxious. One major reason that can especially occur in students when it's midterm time, finals time, you have a lot of tests happening at once, is that your body is under stress because you are not taking care of it. This means that you aren't sleeping properly, you're not eating properly, you're not exercising properly, and all of those, one or all of those, work together to make your body handle stressful situations more poorly. Sleep is a very big one of those that I think comes into play, where often if students are cramming for tests and they're only sleeping a few hours before a test, which means then their body is reacting really poorly to the stressful situation of taking a test. Another cause of test anxiety is when your mind is under stress, which creates a fight or flight mentality. Essentially, when we perceive items as threats, stressful situations as threats, often it fills our bodies with adrenaline. And there are times when students perceive a test as a stressful situation and it increases the adrenaline in your body as a reaction to seeing it as a threat. So part of that is just the fear that you have associated with the test that then ultimately causes your body to react in a more anxious way. Another reason that you may suffer from test anxiety is because you are not familiar with the test material. That means that when you sit down to take the test, you're not prepared in a way that you thought you were, and that's going to make you react with extreme anxiety. But sometimes you might feel perfectly comfortable with the test material, you studied, you're a pro, and it's actually a lack of familiarity with the test format that causes the anxiety. It's sitting down, having to take questions in a timed environment and respond in a certain way that makes you suddenly stressed, suddenly anxious, even though you are familiar with the content.
Thanks, Betsy. Yeah, I think all of those things are so important to think about. And now we also want to think about, how do we prepare our body for these types of situations and kind of managing that stressful scenario. And the first thing we talked about was sleep, right? Creating a consistent sleep schedule as much as you can before the exam. So the first thing that comes to my mind when I think about folks losing sleep before an exam, it comes from my own personal experience, which is cramming. If you're cramming late at night, or dare I say early in the morning before a test, you're less likely to have that good sleep that we know is really beneficial to doing well when you're taking an exam. And if you can create that consistent schedule, a week or weeks ahead of your exam, you'll be in an even better place to take that test when you sit down with your exam. And then the next thing is food. It's important that you eat well, that you stay hydrated, and be sure to eat breakfast, especially if you have an a morning exam, but even if you have an afternoon one as well, it's important to make sure that you're eating your meals on time and that you're staying hydrated so that your body can function appropriately. And it's also important to try to avoid sugar and caffeine if possible, as those two things can really exacerbate the effects of anxiety. I know sometimes it's easy to reach for something sugary or something caffeinated because you think, oh, okay, if I'm trying to cram, I'm trying to study at the last possible moment, maybe this caffeine is really going to give me a boost, but that boost that it gives you is really going to force you to crash later. And so think about, reaching for that water as much as you can in the days leading up to your exam and during your exam session. And then exercise before, if you can, to burn off adrenaline. So like Betsy said, exams can trigger our fight or flight response, which can kind of give us more adrenaline coursing through our bodies. And so exercise is a great way to burn that off. And it's a good idea to experiment with the best times for you to exercise. For some folks, they work best if they exercise in the morning. They can be super focused in the afternoon. Some people who exercise in the afternoon really get another burst of energy. Sometimes though, the trouble with exercising in the afternoon is that you may experience a little bit of difficulty falling asleep. So it's always a good idea to experiment ahead of time, maybe even make notes and journal about what's worked for you in the past when it comes to exercising and getting ready for an exam. And then the last thing I'll note here is breathing beforehand to relieve stress. And one way to do that is called box breathing. And box breathing is where you inhale for a certain count. So let's say you inhale for 4 counts or 4 seconds, you hold that breath inside for 4 seconds, and then you exhale for 4 seconds. And you repeat that strategy to really calm and get rid of some of those stressful feelings. And then next up, we have preparing your mind. It's important to try to take some practice tests, and mimicking the experience can really help you manage that anxiety as well. If you can kind of find yourself in a situation similar to how you'll be taking the test, or, create some practice tests for yourselves, that can help a lot. And then I also want you to think about reviewing past test experiences. So think first about the testing situations in which you did really, really well, because I'm sure those exist. And what about that situation made you successful? And then also think too about what about exams that didn't go so well? Why were they more challenging? Did you cram? Did you not sleep well the night before? Did you forget to eat breakfast? Did you reach for the caffeine maybe instead of the water? All of those pieces of information are data that can really help you be successful in the future, because you can see, okay, I notice a pattern. Maybe when I get 9 hours of sleep 2 nights before and a night before the exam, I'm really able to focus. Whereas if I cram the night before, sometimes I really struggle. And so each of those data points can really help you to know kind of what your ideal exam scenario looks like.
So Carolyn just went over some strategies for the week ahead of time, the night ahead of time, the day of, to help you prep for that test taking situation. I'm going to go over a few strategies that you can use in the moment of taking a test and experiencing stress that can help you manage that anxiety. And we're going to talk about this in terms of 3 different kinds of triggers that can potentially cause your anxiety. The first type are visual triggers. So this is when you are seeing things that cause anxiety. They're often related to auditory triggers, which is when you hear something that causes anxiety, versus internal triggers. So this is the anxiety that comes from within you. So it's helpful to recognize what's causing your anxiety, again, which kinds of triggers are going to make you more anxious, so that you know what specific strategies you can use to counter these circumstances. So first, we're going to talk about visual and auditory triggers, which, as I mentioned, can often be related. So sometimes these triggers can include other students finishing their exams early, maybe the door opening and closing as people leave. I think maybe the one I hear the most is the clock counting down. You can hear the clock, you can see the clock, but it's knowing that you have 10 minutes left in your exam and all of a sudden you can't focus on the work. You just start freaking out. So how can you respond to these triggers? If you're taking a test in a classroom environment, how can you choose a seat that shields you from view of whatever that visual trigger is, whether it's from other students, from the door, or from the clock? Just something as simple as choosing a seat away from those particular triggers can already set you up for success. If you are taking your exams virtually and there's still a clock that is there making you go crazy on your computer screen and you can't avoid it, consider using a Post-it note to cover it up or bringing up another window to place in front of it. If you're worried that your professor or the test proctor will think you're cheating or have materials, reach out to them. Email your professor, say, hey, I am just putting a Post-it note on my screen to cover up the clock because I test better that way. If you feel like noises often cause you anxiety, try to work near a fan or a vent to help block out other sounds. The white noise can kind of help drone out some of those other sounds. Or you could consider wearing earplugs while taking your exam. And this is something else if you're concerned that your professor is going to wonder about that, or if you're in a virtual environment and they see that, just reach out and tell them, I am wearing earplugs because this sound is bothering me and causing anxiety. So internal triggers can include a lot of different categories that often are interrelated. Sometimes the internal anxiety begins with negative thoughts. What if I fail? I don't belong here. It stems from this imposter syndrome that I think a lot of Georgetown students experience, but somehow anxiety about a test can start with, what if I fail this test? And it can quickly spiral out of control. What if I fail this test becomes, what if I fail out of college becomes, what if I fail out of life? And it can escalate really quickly. That can cause negative emotions like panic to set in, frustration, and then often that can cause physical feelings that are negative, such as accelerated heart rate or tension throughout the body. So then these three things become related. One leads to another, which then just makes the thoughts worse. So it's a very dark cycle. So responding to negative thoughts, a lot of times when we have negativity in terms of conscious thoughts in our minds, we try to empty our brains. And that can be difficult. It's more productive to, unless you are trained in meditation or this is an art form you are practicing, it can often be more helpful to respond to those negative thoughts with more rational thoughts, because your brain needs to think about something. So if you are thinking, what if I fail? An appropriate response might be, I haven't failed any tests yet, and I studied hard for this test. If you're thinking that I don't belong here, maybe respond with, if I knew this content already, I wouldn't need to study it. I would be teaching the class instead of acting as a student. But you want to respond to the negative thoughts in a rational way, the same way that you would respond to a friend if they said this to you. If a friend said to you, I don't belong here, how would you try to support them? What rational thought would you counter their negative thought with? And then responding to negative emotions and negative physical feelings, there are a few things that you can do in the moment of taking a test to help calm you down. So one is a tool that Carolyn already mentioned, breathing exercises. Box breathing is something that you can really easily do even in a testing classroom. Another very simple breathing exercise is alternate nostril breathing. For this, you hold your thumb over one nostril, so close it off, and then breathe in through the other nostril. And then you switch which nostril you are closing off, and you breathe out through the other nostril. Then you breathe in, switch, breathe out. And this is another really simple thing you can do in the moment during a test that will help you relax a little bit more. You can also, in terms of more physical self-care, try something called progressive muscle relaxation, which is good if you notice your body's reacting tensely. With this, how it works is you isolate certain muscles. So a good one to start with is maybe a fist. Tighten a fist very briefly for 10 seconds. Don't hurt yourself, but hold a clenched fist for 10 seconds. And then after 10 seconds, just release it and let those muscles relax. And then move on to a different set of muscles, maybe your shoulders. Tensen those muscles on purpose, hold for 10 seconds, and then release them. And another simple trick that is always useful for all kinds of study situations is drinking water. That can also help. And with all of these tools, these are going to really help calm down your body, which we talked about how this is all cyclical. So the idea here is that by calming down your body, you might be able to calm down your emotions and ultimately help calm down the negative thoughts in your mind as well.
Thanks, Betsy. I just got to practice some of my alternate nostril breathing, so I appreciate that. That was a great thing to talk about there. Now for some long-term solutions. So like I touched on before, it's important to try to get into a schedule where you're habitually, regularly exercising and regularly have a sleep schedule where you're waking and falling asleep around the same time every night. Now, I know that things can be tricky. Oftentimes when you're in school, your weekday schedule looks a lot different than your weekend schedule. But as much as you can, try to keep things pretty regular. It's going to help your body really manage that stress and anxiety. And then also think about doing some of those proactive breathing exercises and some meditation if you can. The act of meditation is not meant to be a perfect endeavor. If you can sit with yourself and just do some deep breathing every so often, every little bit helps. And then the last thing, something else that is so important, is really thinking about how are you handling your test preparation? Are you developing a proper study plan? And thinking back to that idea of data, how can you take how you've prepared in the past to help you kind of move forward and prepare better in the future? So the thing that we'll look at next is creating a study cycle. So creating a study cycle consists of two things. So the first thing is preparation, and the second piece is review. So preparation is really the idea that we're identifying and preparing ways that you'll review the material later. So preparation is mostly doing things like developing study guides. Maybe you're making flashcards. You're considering what topics might be an exam. It makes sense when you think about that word preparation. You're preparing yourself to do that review piece. So next up is review. And what is review? Well, that's using all of those preparation tools and strategies to really see if you know that material. So what you can do during a review period is maybe quiz yourself using those flashcards you made, maybe recite your list of topics, and take a practice test that will mimic your testing conditions so that when you get into your testing space, you'll be prepared and you'll know what to expect. So now that we've created kind of the idea of a study cycle, we can take a look at what's called a 5-day study cycle. The idea here is to try to think 5 days ahead of a scheduled exam. So if you know you have an exam on Monday, maybe looking back on your calendar and scheduling those previous 5 to 7 days to really be a time of preparation where you're doing that preparation and review and dedicating sprinkled chunks of time during your week to do both of those things. So you're not tiring your mind out by just reviewing, and cramming. You're really working the preparation and the review in simultaneously. So I would recommend planning 2 to 3 hour long chunks each day, dedicated to preparation, dedicated to review. Maybe the preparation one day is longer, maybe the review is only 20 to 30 minutes. Change it up and see what works best for you. But by the time the exam rolls around, you are going to be well prepared because you will have done the preparation, you will have been able to review over many days, which we know works better than cramming. And the other thing to note is that some students actually do better with a longer study cycle. So if you know that you're the type of person who likes to prepare ahead of time, maybe think about trying a 5-day study cycle and then expanding it later. You know, in the next unit, maybe try a 10-day study cycle or a 7-day study cycle and see how that works. Just really encouraging you here to experiment and see what works best for you.
So there's one type of test question that maybe comes up more often than other types when talking about test anxiety, and that is the multiple choice question. There's something about the format where often test anxiety causes students to change their answers, to overthink. So we have a few strategies for multiple choice questions to help you slow down, focus on the question, and maybe trust yourself a bit more. So one tip is to read the question twice to ensure that you haven't misread it. Often students will just kind of skim the question and then look at the answers and then not even answer the right question. So reading the question twice can help you slow down and focus to make sure you know what you're actually trying to respond to. Probably my number one tip for multiple choice tests is to not look at the answers. Because that's when you start to overthink. You can look at them eventually, but read the question and then try to answer it the way you would fill in the blank question. Look to yourself to see what you think is the right answer before you look at these options that are printed on the test. So when you do look at the answers, look at them one at a time and spend time with each answer considering whether or not that's the correct answer before looking at the next one. So if there are 4 options, don't look at all 4 at once. Look at option 1 and say, do I think this answers the question? Yes or no? And then add in option 2 and compare just those 2 answers. Choose the one that you feel is the most correct and then get rid of the other one. Then compare whichever option seems more correct to option 3. So this way you're never looking at 4 options at once. You're only ever looking at 2 options at the same time and asking yourself which one really responds to the question in the best way. Do not change your initial answer unless you're sure that another answer choice is correct. Of course, sometimes you realize that you've made a mistake, but often test anxiety can cause students to go back and change their answers because they're overthinking it. And typically the initial answer you come up with is the right answer. And then don't dwell on questions you don't know. Make a mark next to the question and continue on to the questions that you do know, and then return to it when you can focus on it with more time. That way too, you're not going to get anxious about time in the same way that you would if you're sticking with one question that you need to spend extra time on.
I love that idea, Betsy, not to dwell on something if you're unsure. You know, just mark it, move along, come back to it if you have time later. But you can spend so much more time actively answering questions you know the answer to, versus sometimes worrying and spinning your wheels on something that you're not quite sure about. So next up, I just want to let everybody know that there is always going to be anxiety. Feeling anxious is a normal part of the test taking process. And maybe that gives you, some sense of relief knowing that you're not alone in feeling this way. Try as much as you can not to let it overcome you. I know sometimes it's easier said than done. But utilizing these strategies can really help ease your nerves, and it can honestly help you perform better when it comes to the exam day. So if you're confronted with day of exam anxiety, take a deep breath and know that if you've done some, a few, or all of these things, you are well prepared.
And then don't be afraid to ask for assistance. One potential way to ask for assistance is to visit your professor's office hours. This could be if there is a test, a class where you continuously feel like you're not performing well on tests due to anxiety. Maybe your professor has practice resources they can recommend. Maybe they can look over a past test and give you tips on how to focus your energies better. If you like the idea of a 5-day study cycle, but feel like the reality is difficult to achieve, consider meeting up with friends for an accountability-based study session. These can be friends in the same class where you get together for 5 days before the test and work on a particular plan. Or these can be friends who aren't in this class at all, and you can say, hey, I just need someone to work with me for these 5 days in a row while I prep for this test. And then if you want assistance going over study strategies or developing a study plan, email us. You can reach out to me, or if you're with the School of Continuing Studies, reach out to Carolyn. And my email address is em911, and Carolyn can be reached at arc-scs. So we wanted to let you know about our next webinar, Developing a Study Plan for Finals. This is going to be Tuesday, November 30th at 4 p.m. And that is the Tuesday after fall break, the last full week of classes. So we're hoping to really help set you up for success with final exams. We're going to talk about how to balance multiple major assignments at once and kind of go over how to break your assignments into more manageable tasks. So a big focus is going to be on figuring out what your individual study schedule can be for that final exam period. And we also want to encourage you to fill out our webinar suggestion form that Carolyn has just posted in the chat. That's a super quick form that just gives us a sense of what kinds of topics you would like to hear us talk about in the spring. We are developing our webinar series topic list for the spring, and we're taking these ideas into consideration as we develop it. Well, thank you so much for coming, and we hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Bye-bye.